Inaugurating today sort of an open-ended series on the pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, so called the pastoral epistles because Paul is writing these letters to Timothy and Titus as pastors, as leaders of churches, and he is using the occasion to give them direction, advice, counsel, and so they're called the pastoral epistles. I well remember my first in-depth personal study of these letters. I was in my last semester of seminary, staring pastoral ministry in a few weeks right in the face. I had received my first appointment to a fairly large suburban church in Houston, Texas, as the associate pastor, and frankly, I was scared to death. I had no clue about what I was going to be doing. You talk about green, I was green in those days. I may be green now, that's just mold. But in those days, it was green of being really young and not knowing what in the world I was going to do. I have often thought that if I were in the position to propose a seminary curriculum, a course of study for those entering the ministry, that I might use as the cornerstone of that curriculum the pastoral epistles, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. They would certainly have a place of prominence in any seminary curriculum that I might propose. They serve, if you please, as a how-to manual for church leadership. We get manuals telling us how to put together various items and how to operate the appliances that we buy and how to keep our car running right and so forth and so on. Well, as far as I'm concerned, the best how-to manual for being a minister in the church are Paul's letters to Timothy and Titus. And notice in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, these words as Paul addresses Timothy. I hope to come to you soon, but I am writing these instructions to you so that if I am delayed, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and bulwark, the pillar and foundation of the truth. Paul gives us here the reason that he is writing to Timothy, and really by extension, why he's writing to Timothy twice and to Titus also. Paul says, I want you to know how the people of God are to conduct themselves in the household of God, which is the church. How we should go about living our lives as disciples of Jesus, and particularly in the context of the church. This is the whole purpose of Paul's writing. Now, the children are returning to school in a couple of days. I well remember when I was in elementary school, that was in the last millennium, okay, long time ago, and in a galaxy far, far away, too. Our little East Texas town where I went to school, I noted somewhere recently the population of Wilmore, and Wilmore has always seemed like a small town to me. I mean, comparatively speaking, it is. But I noticed on the last reported census from Wilmore that it now is 3 times the size of the little town that I went to school in when I was in elementary school. In any event, I remember every 6 weeks in our school system in East Texas, we had 6-week terms and not the 9-week that, do they still have 9 weeks here in Kentucky? That's what it has been, used to be at least. Anyway, every 6 weeks we would get our report cards. And in addition to grades on math and reading and science and so forth and so on, the first column or the first line was the grade that we received in something called deportment. Deportment. Now, that's an old-fashioned word. In fact, it's a very old-fashioned concept, grading children on deportment. But deportment, of course, was a fancy way of saying conduct, behavior, all right? How one conducted himself and second and third and so forth grades. Now that grade in conduct or deportment was based on some expectations. I don't remember our having in elementary school a conduct manual. I don't remember there being a code of conduct that we all had to read or be accountable to. Our expectations for the grade were apparently in the minds of the teachers. But most of us in those days understood very well what was acceptable and what was unacceptable. And if we crossed the line and did what was unacceptable, the teacher, the principal, had a very specific way of dealing with that. And so you learned pretty quick, if you didn't know already, what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. We were to conduct ourselves appropriately, and we were graded on that. Now, those kinds of expectations and even those kinds of grades are universal in human society. You go to school today, and although there may not be a grade in deportment, there are still some things that are acceptable and some things that are unacceptable. And oftentimes these days, schools have a code of conduct, and if you violate that, you're brought up on some kind of accountability. In business, in the professional world, you have acceptable dress, acceptable language expectations. I was shopping in Lowe's the other day, and as I stood there at the checkout counter, I noted a placard there on the counter, and it said something to this effect: profanity, abusive language, and it said some other things towards our employees is unacceptable. We will not tolerate it, Lowe's said. So I asked the lady at the counter, I said, do you ever get profanity? Do you ever get somebody saying that kind of stuff? She says, well, from time to time we do, especially at the service desk, she said. And Lowe's has made it very clear they're not going to put up with that. All right? So we have these kinds of deportment expectations in the business world. Families and households have such rules. These often vary, don't they? The rules of your household may not be the same as my household. I remember when my boys were teenagers, they would have friends over frequently. And one evening, one of the boys had a friend over. He stayed for supper, and he sat down at the table with his hat on. And I said to him, I said, Nate, take your hat off and stay a while. And he said, no, it's fine. And I said, no, Nate, it's not fine. Take your hat off. Because in my house, you didn't sit down at the table with your hat on. That was just house rules. A friend of mine called me up several months ago. He and his wife were coming through central Kentucky, and he called and asked if they could come by and visit. I said, certainly. And as we continued the conversation briefly, he said, oh, by the way, we have our dog with us. And I said, that's fine. We have 109 acres for the dog to run on. We don't have dogs in our house. You may have them in your house, but house rules at my place, no dogs in the house. And so we have such expectations and requirements. And isn't it interesting and instructive that in this passage, Paul describes the church as a household? He says here, the church is the household of God. And so we shouldn't be surprised to find that God's household has certain house rules. There's an expectation, a required code of conduct, if you please, that goes along with becoming and being a follower of Christ, a member of the household of God. So what are we talking about when we talk about how one ought to behave in the church, in the household of God? Are we talking about rules against running in the church? When I was a child, boy, it was absolutely verboten. You didn't run in the church house. And if you did, you could expect to have your bottom warmed. No running in the church. How about the unwritten rule that you don't sit in someone else's seat in church? I find it amusing sometimes up front when we have someone who perhaps is a guest in the worship service, and they'll come and sit in a seat that belongs to somebody else, and then you see those persons come in and they, whoa, Who is sitting in my seat? How about the rule that you don't go overtime? I was in a church one time and we were changing the times of the service. And in the board meeting, we said, all right, well, we're going to start now at 10:45 or whatever it was. And one lady on the board, Denise, she looked at me and said, and we end at 12. And I said, no, that's not part of the proposal. We start at 10:45, and she was making herself known, and she looked at me again, and we end at 12. What about that rule? Well, some of these kinds of things may need to be addressed from time to time, but that's not what Paul is talking about here. He's not talking about not chewing gum or not talking during the sermon or something like that. He's talking about other things. And if you look through 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, you'll find a whole host of issues addressed. Things like leadership in the church. Things like pastor and lay relations. The charity work of the church. The whole issue, which thankfully we don't have to worry about in today's church precisely, but in Paul's day they did. He talked about slaves and masters in the church. The issues of doctrine, true and false doctrine, discussed at length in these letters. How do you deal with troublemakers in the church? There's a good one. Troublemakers. Thankfully, we don't have any troublemakers here at High Bridge Church. We got rid of them all right. What about troublemakers in the church? Gender roles, men, women, and older men, and so forth and so on. Well, in the weeks ahead, we're going to cover these topics and more. But today, I want to focus on the underlying philosophy of church behavior, the basis, the foundation of church behavior, the general principle that is to sort of underlie all other issues in the church. Let me suggest some possible options to you as this sort of ground floor, this foundational structure about how the church is to operate and how people in it are to operate. Some possible options. Years ago, I had a man in my church who said to me one time, the church is supposed to be a hospital for sinners and not a rest home for saints. The church is supposed to be, he said, a hospital for sinners and not a rest home for saints. By the way, you can type that phrase into your electric computer on the search engine. You can Google it, and you'll find all kinds of interesting observations on both sides of that statement. One of the more intriguing ones I found was a fellow who argued that the church is not a hospital for sinners, it's a morgue, he said. A morgue. Oh, I was captivated by that thought. I thought, what in the world does he mean by that? So I read his little article, and he said, yes, the hospital, or the church rather, is to be a morgue for sinners because people who are sinners are dead in their sins. And he's right about that. That's scriptural. But he said it's a special kind of morgue where you don't just bring dead bodies, but where they come back to life. I like that. But what about this hospital for sinners idea? Well, there's a number of implications in this proposed ground rule for the church, including, of course, Jesus' statement about his coming to call the sick and not the well. And so this idea that the church is to be a hospital for sinners has merit, but is this the basic premise for the code of conduct in God's household? Is the church to be a hospital for sinners? Is this what Paul presents it as in his epistles? Is this what the New Testament means when it talks about the church? Well, we'll talk about that, but let me move on to suggest another overarching theme that some have suggested, and that is that church behavior, the way the church goes about its business, the way people, you and I, act in the church, should always be based on love. The love commandment, the love expectation, the call to love. After all, love is the great commandment. Jesus said you are to love the Lord your God with everything you have and your neighbor as well. And so, many people have felt that the church, more than anything else, foundational to everything, the church ought to be a place of love. And certainly, I think all churches, certainly this one, as far as I know, wants to be known as a loving church. Amen? Of course. We don't want to be known as an unloving church, do we? But is love and is loving the church's prime directive in the pastoral epistles? Well, we'll see about that. A third possible organizing principle, foundational ethic, might have to do with some sort of a power matrix. I was talking with a pastor some years ago, a man up until that time that frankly I had admired very much. And he was telling me about his church. And he said that he had wanted his church to undertake a mission project that was going to cost about $10,000. And the church was balking at that. Now, they supported lots of missions, but they felt that this $10,000 commitment was a little too much. And so, the pastor related to me that he told his church, if you don't authorize spending $10,000 for this project, I'm going to go to the bank and borrow $10,000 in the church's name and take that money and bury it in the backyard. And you'll have to repay the bank with interest anyway. And then he added this to that. He said to me, I'm like the Pope in my church. I get whatever I want. Frankly, I was shocked. I was shocked and dismayed. I know of pastors who keep things from their congregation because they don't want that information to cause trouble. So they hide things from their church. Sometimes churches are organized in sort of unofficial power situations. Sometimes it's the seniority principle at work. You ever been in a church like that where people who are the oldest or maybe have been in the church the longest, they just kind of run things? We had a lady like that in one of my churches some years ago. She was quite advanced in years, and she was a little bitty tiny woman, but I'm telling you what, she was the power in that church. She told me one time how a previous pastor had asked her if he could do so and such in the church, and she said, I told him, you tried that, we just won't have church anymore. Is that to be the way the church operates? Sometimes very powerful personalities in the church can run it. Is the church to be conducted by the powerful? A fourth ethic, again, very, very popular in our day, is the ethic of tolerance and acceptance. Affirmation. We want everyone to be accepted. We want everyone to be tolerated. We want everyone to feel affirmed, some say. That's the way the church ought to operate. One denomination in our country for the past 25 years has had as its brand, the way it advertises itself, open hearts, open minds, open doors. Well, should the church be a place of open doors? Certainly. We throw our doors open every Sunday morning. They're not locked. We don't have a guard at the door saying you can come in and you can't. We certainly want to be open. We want to be a place where people feel welcomed, a place where everybody's worth is recognized. By the way, if you don't think everybody's worth should be recognized, then you need to stay at home, because your worth is no greater than anybody else's, nor is mine. So we want a church where everyone's worth is recognized. Scripture demands this, but is this to be the foundation upon which the household of God builds its code of conduct? Before we move on, let me observe that each of these ideas has some merit, some application when it comes to the way the church is to organize itself and to conduct itself. Paul actually refers to all of these suggestions in the pastorals: love and mercy for the sin sick, lines of authority, acceptance. All of these are mentioned, but none of these provides the foundation for which we are looking for the church's conduct. So what does? We've suggested several that are inadequate. What is the adequate foundation? Very simply, Paul says the church is to be the foundation of the truth. The truth is the organizing ethic, principle, overarching theme, the foundation of everything the church does or proposes to do. Paul says the church is the pillar and bulwark of the truth. The household of God is built upon the truth. It upholds the truth. Nothing else ultimately matters. Listen, the only remedy for sin and sinners, if we are going to be a hospital, at least in some aspect, the only remedy for sin is the truth. It's the truth. A false diagnosis, erroneous treatment does the sinner no good. The only love that is from God is true love. Love that is insincere, that is inauthentic, love that is not according to truth is a false love. It's fake. It's artificial. John says in 1 John 3:18, let us not love in word or speech, but in deed and in truth. So if the church is going to be a loving place, that love has to issue and be connected to and anchored in the truth. Power and authority that is not grounded in God's truth is abusive and carnal. A church structure that falsely empowers does not accomplish God's work. The lines of authority, leadership, that kind of thing has to be according to the truth. If we accept those things or affirm those things, whether they be ideas or theologies or morals that are not in accord with sound doctrine, as Paul mentions in 1 Timothy 1:10, when we do that, we have repeated the wickedness and ungodliness of Romans 1 by exchanging the truth about God for a lie. And so as we seek to welcome and to recognize the worth of every person, that must be grounded and anchored in the truth. Over and over again in the pastorals, Paul draws the connection between the truth as communicated through what he calls good doctrine in 1 Timothy 4:6 and the behavior and conduct of the church. The way we relate to one another, the way we conduct ourselves is to be grounded in sound teaching, Paul says. So as we initiate this study of the pastoral epistles, we are anchoring our conclusions, our observations in the truth, not in current fads, all right? Not in majority opinion. We're not concerned with popular perspectives, with pragmatism. I've known churches that spend a lot of time and give themselves to finding what works or appears to work. Well, if it works, but it's not according to truth, what good is it, ultimately? We're not concerned with personal preferences. We're not talking about here whether you don't mind people wearing their hat in your house or not. We're not talking about that. Programs that may be popular and well thought of in the present day is not our concern. We want to know the truth as it is in Jesus, as Paul says in Ephesians 4:21. Unfortunately, in today's church, the truth is being laid aside, compromised, watered down, and sometimes explained away. From every angle, theological, sociological, psychological, political, the truth is under assault. I hope you have your ears on and your eyes open, because it's going on all around us. My friends, if we gain political power, if we make ourselves and others feel good, if we were to remake society more justly, according to some people's evaluation, if we did all of that at the expense of the truth, what have we gained? And so we want to know the truth. We want to state the truth. We want to build the church upon the truth. We want to correlate our conduct both within the church in terms of geography while we're here. within the church in terms of how we relate to one another, but also beyond the church in the way we conduct ourselves towards outsiders, the way we witness to the faith, the way we think, the way we prioritize, the way we understand the world around us. We want all of that to be based upon, anchored in, formed by, led by, undergirded by the truth. Now, that was the introduction. Next week, don't worry, it's not until next week. Next week, we're going to look at this whole issue of leadership in the church. That's exactly where Paul starts the first epistle to Timothy. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the issue of leadership. If you would like to get a little head start, let me encourage you to read 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. They're short, they're brief letters, it won't take you long. Read through those and look specifically, in preparation for next week, at the issue of leadership. Paul addresses Timothy as a leader and how he is to lead. Paul talks more broadly about the qualifications for leaders. If someone wants to be a leader, well, what kinds of qualification, what kind of resume must they have? Paul discusses that. He talks about how Timothy is to recognize leadership in the church and what leaders are to do. And so a number of issues regarding leadership in the church. We'll take a look at that next week. Your assignment, if you choose to accept it, is to read 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, especially concerning the issue of leadership.